Welcome to Tales Told When the Windows Rattle. I'm Tim Prossel. Here's a story from the Vera Van Slyke Ghostly Mysteries series that makes reference to a rather in-depth case that Vera handled at the Morley Mansion in Boston. This is chronicled in a book titled Guilt is a Ghost. However, this story you're about to hear comes from a different book titled Help for the Haunted. And the title of this story is An Unanchored Man. The breadth of a book would be needed to properly recount the investigation of the Morley Mansion haunting. Undoubtedly, it was the most complex and dangerous case that I shared with Vera Van Slyke to that date, which was October of 1903. In the wake of this adventure, however, Vera and I had an experience that, while less complicated, far better illustrates the remarkable expanse of the spirit dimension. As we were in Boston, we decided to take advantage of our nearness to Cape Cod and devote a week to relaxation. Few tourists remained in the seaside town of Granger, and I imagined its unoccupied beach would provide me with a tranquil setting for reading. True to her nature, Vera was more interested in the seafood and the beer. "I'm hoping we might hunt down some of this town's music, too," she said as we unpacked our bags in the hotel room. "These maritime towns are filled with local musicians who play rousing sea shanties and melancholy airs. It must be the Irish blood in me that explains my affection for such music." Playfully, I grabbed a bedpost and steadied myself against it. "Mercy, I'm shocked," I jested. "You've let slip something about your family." Vera tilted her head and stared. She then turned to me. "Have I never mentioned my mother was Irish?" I grinned. "Not in the 4 years that I've known you." She resumed transferring her clothes to a dresser drawer. "About as Irish as they come, I'd say. As a young girl, she left County Sligo, fleeing the Great Famine. Met my father in upstate New York. At bedtime, she used to sing me the old songs." "That's very sweet," I said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Not everyone has a mother like that. Did she also tell you those ghost stories you said you loved as a girl?" "You might think so, given how the Irish love a spooky yarn, but no, I found those on my own. In fact, my mother admonished me regularly about what she called your pukas and your banshees." I chuckled. I shouldn't have brought it up. We're here to get away from our pukas and our banshees for a while. Once unpacking was finished, we asked the hotel clerk where we might find some musical entertainment for the evening. We had missed the last of a series of band concerts held on the town common, he said. Scratching his neck, he added that amateur musicians sometimes gathered to imbibe and play together at a waterfront tavern called Scully's. The clerk suddenly straightened his posture and clarified that we should go there only if accompanied by men. He insisted that it was no place for 2 women traveling alone. "2 women traveling alone, sir," snarled Vera, "is an error in basic mathematics. Scully, if I'm not mistaken, is an Irish name, suggesting this tavern is exactly the type of place I have in mind. You will write down the address, thank you kindly." Bowing in penitence, the clerk obeyed orders. That evening, I learned the hotel clerk might have been doing the honorable thing by cautioning us against this establishment. It was located in a section of town rarely revealed to tourists, an area where the buildings gasped for paint, and the railroad tracks beside them choked on high weeds. The tavern's interior was almost as unwelcoming. Granted, the darkly stained walls and the crisscrossed oars hanging on them had a certain rustic charm. Still, the few conversations being held by patrons ceased as we looked for a place to sit. We were silently observed as we chose one of the few tables in the place. Most of the customers sat upon stools along the bar, and they continued to gawk at us in that formation. "What can I get you, ladies?" called the bartender. He was a burly man with a heavy black beard. Nonetheless, his dapper vest and collar showed that he was no brute. "Bring us 2 of your finest beers, please," Vera returned. "Let's see if you New Englanders can brew an ale that's as hearty as the ones back in Chicago." She winked at me. I very much hoped that Vera's friendly challenge would be received more as friendly than challenge. The bartender grinned, and the other patrons began to lose interest in us. I noticed then that one elderly gentleman had paid us no mind at all. He sat by himself at a rear table, facing the back wall. His sparse white hair and lopsided slouch were the only bits of information he was divulging about himself. "My brother runs cargo through Chicago," explained the barman with a fine baritone voice. As he delivered our beers, he added, "Prefers the lakes to the oceans. He was always the dainty teacup of the family, you see." His smirk revealed that he had accepted Vera's invitation to a verbal fencing match. "I do see," Vera returned. "However, this establishment was recommended not for what I would see, but for what I might hear. Is it true that there's a chance of some music being played at some point?" "Oh, you flatter me. It's not often I get asked to take my concertina off the wall. If you're lucky, a few of my regulars will play louder on their own instruments, but none of them have arrived just yet." The gentleman then introduced himself as Scully. It was a nickname he had given himself after, as he phrased it, demolishing some very fine Harvard boys in a sculling race one weekend in Cambridge. When Vera inquired about his true name, he introduced himself as Marcello Silva. I chuckled at Vera's pursed lips when Mr. Silva explained his ancestors had sailed from Portugal, not the Emerald Island. "And as we're so cozy with one another now," Mr. Silva continued, "may I ask what brings you two landlubbers to the east?" Perhaps I had been too eager to join the conversation. "We came to investigate certain reports in Boston," I told him. Mr. Silva cocked his head. "Reports about what?" One by one, the patrons at the bar began to turn back to us, and I noticed Vera sigh. In a flurry, I searched for ways to avoid the very subject that Vera and I had come here to escape. We investigate hauntings, ghosts, and that." I winced. When I reopened my eyes, I was met with the blank faces and undivided attention of everyone at the bar. Indeed, Mr. Silva pulled over a chair and sat down. With a grin, Vera shrugged. I knew that I would have to relate the whole story of the haunting of the Morley mansion. Truth be told, I rather enjoyed the intrigue I stirred in my audience, who inched closer and closer during my narrative. The stupefied silence following my finale was more gratifying than applause. I had even managed to get a few backward glances from the elderly man so determined to avoid being disturbed. Though there was much debate over the veracity of my tale, Vera and I became the guests of honor. We were treated to more beers than I cared to admit. Once the bartender's musical regulars arrived, we were granted an evening of rousing sea chanties and melancholy airs. The small crowd escorted us safely back to our hotel, much to the consternation of the same desk clerk who had regretted ever mentioning the place to us. The following morning, I awoke with a headache. Vera suggested we enjoy some ocean air, and we went to the shore fronting the hotel. She wandered off to seek low-tide treasures while I remained sitting on the hotel veranda to read. My novel, though, turned out to be frustratingly jumbled and broody. A young man with dreams of going to sea finds work on a whaler, one whose capricious captain is driven by extracting revenge against the sea beast who lost him his leg. Instead, I had been hoping for swashbuckling pirates in pursuit of hidden jewels. My eyes drifted from the pages to the waves, and I jolted when a scratchy voice blasted beside me. "What potions have I drunk of siren tears?" snarled a white-bearded man. Though he chortled, his scarcity of teeth failed to add much whimsy to the odd comment. First, I realized that the reference to a siren had been directed to me. Next, I recognized the man from his sideways slouch. He stood as if he were a sack of grain that someone had barely managed to balance upright. I said, "You startled me, sir. Aren't you the gentleman who drank alone, who was with us at Scully's last evening?" He nodded. "That was myself, missy, but there's no need to be startled," he said, the soft R in his last word revealing a strong New England accent. "I'm not much for manners, I suppose. It's just I'm curious about that experience you spoke of." The ghosts there in Boston. I come by to tell you, that is, I wanted you to know. He stopped there and suddenly looked down at his boots. As he was not sitting down, I thought it best to join him standing. I asked, "To know what, sir?" He looked up, and my new position allowed me to see that his eyes were dim with age. The dark, deep wrinkled frames around those eyes implied it was not time, but experience that accounted for his state of physical collapse. "To know that I believe you. I believe you're tangled with ghosts up there. I believe because I myself have ghosts. The Marathas come charging through my cottage some nights. Lately it's been all nights, and that's why you found me out among folks. Drive me out of my own bed, they do. I come looking to see if you got some incantation or such to send 'em back into the sea." Slowly he nodded yet again. Something about his demeanor gave me a chill. I snapped shut my book, startling myself again in the process. "Well, the woman you saw me with last night is the one to consult. She's the expert. I simply assist." I smiled as best I could. I waved and called to Vera, perhaps with more urgency than was polite. She waved back and began to tromp through the sand toward us. I was both dismayed and pleased that she did not take the time to put her shoes back on her feet. The man beside me rubbed his pocked nose and then looked down at his boots again. He muttered, "I ain't like that fella in your tale of the mansion. I ain't a millionaire." The obviousness of this fact evoked a pang of sympathy in me. "You needn't worry about paying us. If Miss Van Slyke feels she can help, she will do so. My name is Lucille Parcell, and how shall I introduce you?" Once Vera arrived, I introduced her to Captain Henry Thorne Lord. I glimpsed her lips tighten instantly upon hearing his professional title. Rigidly, she offered her hand. She then remained silent. As the captain seemed unpracticed in social amenities, I told Vera what little I knew about his haunted cottage. I emphasized how his ghosts charged around the place, even chasing him out, and I suggested to Vera that this might be our first chance to witness what Catherine Crowe terms a poltergeist in her famous Guide to Ghosts. "Well then," Vera replied, "the case is certainly of interest. Shall we discuss the details over lunch? I'm told there's a lovely restaurant just across the—" "I ain't hungry," Captain Lord interrupted bluntly. These were the first words he spoke to her. Clearly, he was unaware of the danger of keeping Vera Van Slyke from her lunch. She merely raised her eyebrows, however. After slowly smoothing one of those eyebrows with her little finger, Vera said, "We can easily begin our inquiry here." She sat down on the veranda railing. I considered resuming my seat, but as the captain remained standing, I felt I should too. Though it was entirely likely that our new client's refusal of lunch was more a matter of finance than appetite, his unapologetic manner had been nonetheless disconcerting. I discreetly slid closer to Vera. "Lucille says your ghosts charge through your cottage. Are they visible, then?" "No, can't see 'em. But you feel 'em shaking the floor like one of those earthquakes out on the west coast. Knock the lamps over, they do, and shake the dust from the rafters. Even a chain of trolling hooks I had fixed firm above my fireplace come down." "And this occurs randomly rather than, say, only on windy nights?" asked Vera. "Ain't a single natural explanation for it," the captain lamented. "As I asked the missy here, I'm hoping you have a spell to drive 'em back to the sea. I'm fond of the little cottage. Think of it as my final port and that." "There are no magical spells for evicting ghosts, Mr. Lord, but we might be able to help you. I have one pivotal question, though. Throughout your sailing career, were you primarily a fisherman, or did you transport cargo? If the latter, was your cargo ever of African origin and sold at auction?" Despite our time together, Vera still managed to befuddle me with some of the initial questions she asked our clients. Regardless, they frequently came to pertain directly to the heart of the haunting. In fact, this question clearly held particular meaning for Captain Lord. For the first time, he looked directly into Vera's eyes. "I know full well what you're asking, madam. I'm an old man, but surely you don't think me old enough to have imported slaves from Africa. I'd wager a month's salary you haven't even a notion when such practice was deemed illegal." 1808, Vera returned with a brittle tone. Of course, smuggling followed that, but I was referring to shipping slaves from, say, Virginia down to Louisiana, a practice that ended roughly 40 years ago. Seamen generally begin their careers as young men, Mr. Lord, and you are clearly a man who's seen at least 7 decades go by. A sneer came to the captain's grisly face. Sure enough, back during my apprentice days, I bunked with those who had sailed on slavers. From the very start, though, I worked solely on fishing boats, madam. His hand was rising and taking the form of a fist. It's a chain of trolling hooks, I said, fell from my wall. No chain of manacles, madam. He struck his fist into his palm. Though my breath stopped and my neck clenched, Vera remained calm. She merely stared back into Captain Lord's glaring eyes. As such, we shall take your case, Mr. Lord, she said at last. Lucille and I will visit you this evening if you jot down the location for us. Come, we'll find paper and pen inside the lobby. The captain complied with Vera's instructions and departed without another word. Vera and I lunched at the Granger Galley, a cozy eatery whose tablecloths and drapes were embroidered with seashells and sandpipers. The black-haired proprietress put down her newspaper with a smile, laughing at our being her only customers since the one at breakfast. The menu, which changed daily, was confined to a chalkboard. Vera ordered the cod, and I surrendered to the scent of chowder wafting from the kitchen. I also surrendered to a nagging curiosity once our hostess left us alone. 1808, I began. I didn't know that bringing slaves from Africa was outlawed at such an early date. You would have no reason to know such a thing, Vera replied a bit snappishly. And you do? Vera looked back at the chalkboard before saying, I should have asked if I could get lemon with my cod. I took a less leisurely approach. Why did you ask Captain Lord if he had been involved in the slave trade? Oh, the usual matter about guilt, she replied, turning back in my general direction. Guilt and ghosts swirl together in all of our cases. I wondered if our ancient mariner might be reflecting back over his life. What other past sins might stab at the conscience of a seaman of his generation? She snatched the salt shaker to examine it more closely. I doubt that someone engaged in slavery is capable of feeling much guilt about it. Your question was so distinctive that I wonder if it might have sprung from your own concerns. I watched my friend pour a small amount of salt into her palm and taste it. It was my turn to be snappish. Come now, Vera, it's a salt shaker. Tip it and salt comes out. She inhaled deeply, returned the shaker to its place, and exhaled slowly. There is a reason that I so seldom speak of my family. Yes, you are correct about the question having less to do with this sea captain, more to do with my own concerns. This was a side of Vera that I had rarely witnessed. I spoke with greater compassion than I think I had ever shown her previously. Vera, you and I have been through quite a lot together. Don't you know that She cut me off, confessing, my grandfather was a sea captain, too. He sailed slaves on that route between Virginia and Louisiana. A shameful thing, and it seems to have clouded my questioning of this fellow. I've never been at ease around men of his profession, but he claims to be a different sort of sailor, a fisherman. So let us not be weepy women, and instead consider this business of ghostly marauders with clear heads. Despite her quick evasion, I considered this one of the most intimate moments I had ever shared with Vera. Of course, I strongly suspected there was more to this family history than she was telling. However, as she once said, a crack in the egg today can with time become a roasted goose. He said something curious, Vera continued. He said he wished we could magically drive these ghosts back to the sea. Yet nothing else in his story suggested they would have come from there. Why does he fancy these to be briny ghosts? Crew members lost while hauling in the catch, I offered. No guilt in that, but if they served him well, these men have a way of hardening to the risks involved. Even those on the Great Lakes are far from dainty teacups, despite what Mr. Scully suggested. What was his name? Mr. Silva, I answered. The image of this hefty, affable gentleman inspired an idea I knew Vera might not like. It occurs to me that Mr. Silva knows this town and probably Captain Lord far better than we do. And the captain, did he strike you as a bit unsavory? Might it be wise, or warranted, to ask Mr. Silva to accompany... Vera again interrupted. Mr. Silva strikes me as a man who would be game for some ghost hunting. It's a small town. Quite likely this woman fixing our meal would know how we can contact him and extend an invitation. As our thank you for the music last night, I added. Vera winked. Yes, of course, for the music, so she said. Indeed, the restaurateur knew how we could reach Mr. Silva during the day. He promptly informed us he could easily find a substitute bartender and would be delighted to join our investigation. The captain's cottage was in a lonely spot, Mr. Silva explained, and the way to it was too rough for a buggy. He gave us the option of, in his words, surf or saddle. Vera and I both eagerly chose his rowing us rather than our riding horses. He met us at the wharf an hour before dusk. The sea was calm during our short voyage, but Vera and I huddled against one another for warmth. We distracted ourselves from the cold air by engaging our companion in conversation. Before long, Mr. Silva recounted a romance about the woman who convinced him to leave the sea behind. The story ended as a tragedy, though, when he spoke of her succumbing to diphtheria just a year or so before its antitoxin became widely known. I take comfort in the notion that she's now an angel, Mr. Silva concluded, letting the oars drift. He then resumed rowing more vigorously. On the other hand, I refuse to think of her as a ghost. I confess, ladies, I'm a bit of a skeptic when it comes to the dead rattling chains or carrying their heads tucked underneath their arms. Certainly the woman you describe awaits you in heaven, I said. But the magnitude of the afterlife is very much a mystery, especially to those of us who investigate it. I'm inclined to think that there's room enough for both angels and ghosts. Quite true, Vera affirmed. The sheer variety of ghosts we've encountered suggests almost unlimited possibilities in the spirit realm. For example, prior to this case, I'd never heard of ghosts at Stampede. On this topic, let's say I call you Scully. What do you know about our client? Is there anything in Mr. Lord's past that might plague him now with a guilty conscience? I know nothing about his past. All I know is that doing business with him is like scraping barnacles. Takes determination. At times, he'll tense his muscles, as if he's readying to throw a punch. Always walks up before he does, though. That seems like a sign of a man who's trying to do the right thing. Or hoping to not repeat a past crime, Vera suggested. I worried that Vera's ill feelings toward sea captains might incline her to make unfair judgments. I attempted to change the subject. The captain mentioned that he had trolling hooks draped above his mantle. This struck me as odd, but I'm a landlubber, as you say, Mr. Silva. Is that odd? He laughed. Wish I could blame you landlubbers for that, Miss Parcell, but we do it ourselves, too. Funny thing, turning tools of the sailing trades into decorations. Lighthouses, anchors, even buoys and lobster traps. The old skipper is likely trying to put a smidgen of beauty in his life by hanging that line of hooks in his parlor. Kind of like a strand of garland. Well, I said, that somehow makes him seem even lonelier, more sympathetic. I feared Vera might disagree with this comment. However, she peacefully surveyed the passing shore for the rest of our ride. The town had given way to untamed coastline, and the few leaves remaining on the scattered trees blazed a bloody red as the sun was beginning to touch the treetops. In this ruddy and slanted light, I recognized Captain Lord's lopsided figure waiting for us on a pier in the distance. It was the very same moment that I felt the hard prod of my own foolishness. Good heavens, Vera, I cried. The oboes! I forgot the oboes! Vera glanced rapidly around the boat before saying, Well, this is unfortunate. But don't let it upset you, my dear. We both forgot the oboes. Understandably so. We came to Cape Cod for leisure, not for work. Oboes? Mr. Silva inquired. Should I have brought along my concertina? Vera explained, The oboes help us confirm that we're dealing with the supernatural. Nonetheless, should Mr. Lord's ghosts come charging, no doubt that will serve as ample evidence. It is sad you didn't bring your concertina, though. We might have to spend quite a while waiting for something to happen. My chagrin over the oboes had eased by the time we reached the pier, though being back in the company of Captain Lord produced a feeling worse still. All without uttering a word, he caught the rope thrown by Mr. Silva, secured the boat, and helped Vera and me out. The sandy slope up to the cottage was long, and I noticed that the path had been outlined with driftwood. Clearly the reclusive captain did have a sense of decor, humble though it was. The cottage was well-weathered but picturesque. The moment we stepped inside, Vera halted. She grasped my arm. "The oboes are expendable," she said, "but now we've lost our bartender." True enough, our escort was no longer with us. Vera shot a cold glance at the captain before she turned to check outside. I tilted my head and grinned at our host. He resumed his habit of examining his footwear. Pardoning myself, I quickly joined Vera. Mr. Silva was a few yards off the path, standing in a patch of grassy sand beside the cottage.
"Spotted something unusual over here," he called to us. "It's a fluke."
"This entire case is the result of a fluke," Vera said as she strolled to the spot.
"I mean a whale fluke. Well, the marks of one. Or maybe of a few," Mr. Silva said. "An easy way to tell whales from a fish is the hind flippers. On fish, they go up and down like a rudder. On whales, they're flat as a pancake, and they're called flukes. They would leave a print looking very much like this." He waved us closer and then squatted down. Though the fading light made them difficult to discern, winding impressions were scattered in the sand. Mr. Silva used his hands and arms to show the lengths of each print, and there surely did seem to be a single pattern to each. Captain Lord came toward us, revealing the difficulty he had walking in sand. He scolded, "The ghosts strike within the cottage." "Of course," replied Mr. Silva, "but have you noticed these prints? I was just saying they resemble the marks beached whales would make. Same prints left by those blackfish that beached themselves."
"Blackfish?" I asked.
"They're a kind of whale, despite the name. A whole school of them were stranded on a beach not too far from here just last year."
You're talking like a lunatic. The tide don't come this far for 'em to have left such marks. And where are the carcasses? Or the stench?
"I'm not saying they are actual fluke prints," Mr. Silva insisted. "I'm saying there's a resemblance."
Vera pressed 2 fingers against the side of her jaw. She wandered off a few steps, apparently to contemplate what this meant.
"Come help me build a fire, son,"
said Captain Lord, assuming an unexpectedly congenial tone.
"The night brings a mighty chill this time of year."
As the gentleman and I started for the door again, Vera remained where she was, gazing at the prints in the sand. I called to her, but it seemed as if my words flittered like moths. Finally, she turned to me. She dropped her fingers slowly from her jaw and then ambled back to the cottage door. If Vera were theorizing in the direction that I suspected she might be, we were likely to have a difficult time ahead of us, not just in dealing with stampeding spirits, but also in convincing our companions of the origins of those spirits. The interior of the captain's cottage was spare, but not uncomfortable. A patchwork of burlap squares did the work of a rug. A magazine illustration of a medieval castle was tacked to the wall, an ancient fortress curiously at odds with its nautical surrounding. A broken flower pot on the single small table revealed how the captain's attempt to beautify the place had been dashed by his supernatural intruders. I noticed the chain of large fish hooks glimmering above the fire the men built. The flames grew, and the various signs of loneliness were cast into shadow as the 4 faces there now became highlighted. Vera requested that a lantern be set beside the door, explaining it might prove useful should we need to flee the violent manifestation. With that in place, we gathered chairs by the hearth. Either out of deference or discomfort, Captain Lord sat on a stool several feet removed from the warmth of the fireplace. Leaning against the wall, he lit a pipe, which I suspected was his means to avoid conversation. Vera also remained silent. Mr. Silva and I chatted about how whales, being mammals, suckle their young and surface in order to breathe. We meandered through other topics, oboes and concertinas, the novel that had disappointed me that morning, and the linguistic nuances distinguishing New England from the Middle West. As often occurs in such situations, there was a moment of quiet during which we all stared into the fire. Whales that beached themselves? Vera asked this as a casual rejoinder to some topic just discussed, but at least an hour had passed since Mr. Silva had mentioned the beached blackfish when describing those curious prints in the sand. It took a moment before our new friend grasped her meaning. Luckily, his sails caught wind and he moved forward.
Ah, yes, last year. A whole school stranded itself on shore. The oddest thing, but there's a long history of these beachings. The poor creatures come close to the shoals, probably to feed, and the tide goes out, leaving them to perish on shore. It's almost as if they forgot they belong in the sea.
And yet I once heard whales described as intelligent creatures, Vera commented.
Now that's the very thing of it,
Mr. Silva exclaimed. Vera quickly raised her finger to her lips, bidding Mr. Silva to hush. She pointed to Captain Lord, who had extinguished his pipe and was now dozing against the wall. As he had endured several restless nights, it seemed best that we let him sleep. Mr. Silva turned from that direction back to Vera with a smile and a nod.
That's the very thing of it, he repeated in a whisper. Whales are smart. I've heard tell of a crew who harpooned a bull which then sounded. Once it resurfaced, they discovered that a cow alongside it had bitten on the rope to free her mate. And one of my regulars at the bar swears they're clairvoyant. If one whale is under attack, others somehow know it and either flee or even come to its aid.
Might this response be the result of the attacked whale thrashing and splashing in the water? Vera asked, keeping her own voice quiet. Mr. Silva moved his head from side to side.
The others will sometimes be too far away to hear any splashing. If it's any sound at all, more likely it's the singing of the whales.
Whales are very smart indeed if they've mastered the art of song, I said, suspecting that Mr. Silva might be making sport of us.
Not singing in that sense exactly, he replied. It's more of a deep-bassed warble. I've heard it described as the groan of Goliath as he fell.
Exactly then, as if cued by a symphony conductor, the poker leaning against the fireplace began to clatter. We noticed that the bricks supporting it were vibrating. The rattling poker suddenly fell with a clang. The three of us could only look at one another dumbly. Our attention was then pulled toward a new sound. Captain Lord began to mutter inarticulately, though every other sign told us he remained sleeping. As I had expected, Vera said softly as she rose from her chair. Something haunts this old salt in his dreams as well as in his cottage. Something shameful enough to rupture the membrane between the physical and spirit dimensions. Lucille, would you light the lantern by the door and wait there? As I stood, I felt the unsteady vibrations in my feet. Mr. Silva then rose, and he must have felt the tremors also. He steadied himself against the bricks of the fireplace. The chain of trolling hooks started to shudder and shake. All of a sudden it slipped, but Mr. Silva managed to safely catch the chain before it struck the floor. Obviously exhausted, Captain Lord continued in his disturbed slumber. He grumbled some words that sounded like a hound attempting to speak. You might stand by the door too, Scully, Vera said. She stepped gingerly to the captain and then glanced back at both of us. Lucille, the lantern, by the door. I had forgotten my task, mesmerized by the quaking cottage. With a gasp, I rushed to the door. Shaken by fear as much as by the floor, I managed to lift the glass chimney, light the wick, and replace the chimney without dropping the lantern. Allowing a glass lantern one lit and filled with oil to break on the floor would, of course, be disastrous. Holding it firmly, I was now free to see that Vera was kneeling down beside Captain Lord. What is it? What do you see? She asked him. Despite supporting herself by pressing a hand against the wall, she still lurched each time the cottage shook. The spindly chair that had been Mr. Silva's suddenly tipped over. After stepping toward it, presumably to set it upright, he waved it off and moved behind Vera. My eye caught the magazine illustration tacked to the wall, the incongruous medieval scene. Something had swiped it into the air, leaving the tack behind. Not even a mighty castle could withstand the convulsions assailing this frail cottage. Our host continued to growl in the grip of his nightmare. "Tell us, you old sinner," Vera demanded, "what stalks you in your dreams?" The captain barked a string of words that were only slightly coherent. Vera twisted to Mr. Silva, saying, "Was that, 'I'll not have another junior on my hands'?" She spun back to the captain. "Did you have a son? Are you ashamed of having another son?" The tremors were growing in power now. Clumps of dust and dirt fell from the pine beams overhead. I spotted what appeared to be a bend in one of those supports. Stepping closer, I raised the lantern to it. Through the falling debris, I glimpsed a crack in the timber. It was split apart for a mere instant as the quaking became stronger. "Vera," I coughed more than articulated. "Vera, we better go now. This beam doesn't look right." Without turning to me, she shouted, "It's vital that we discover the source of guilt before we can attend to the manifestation." But the volume of her voice was just enough to rouse the captain. He blinked hard while his eyes darted amid the rocking furniture.
"Not again," he moaned. "Are they back again?"
Something invisible slammed against one of the legs of the table, forcing that leg inward. The flower pot upon it slid off, smashing on the floor. Another fierce blow collapsed the table altogether. I squinted to see that the gap in the ceiling beam was now split further. It gaped like the cruel grin of a toothless devil. "I insist that we leave now," I shrieked. "We might be crushed." Vera and Mr. Silva turned from me to look at one another. Without a word, they both grabbed Captain Lord by his arms and dragged him toward the door. I felt an impulse to shove my way before them, but somehow, feeling the lantern in my hand reminded me to do the nobler thing. I ushered them through the door first, and I was barely outside when I heard Vera calling, "Lucille, quickly, the lantern!" She was running to the spot where Mr. Silva had found the curious prints in the sand. I left Mr. Silva supporting the rattled captain and rushed to Vera's side. There I saw what I can only describe as flashes of wide, wet canvas being slapped fiercely against the ground. The images remained visible for only the duration of each strike, and they were occurring at unpredictable points. Vera pulled me backward. One of the heavy slaps could easily have come down upon our legs. At a safe distance, we were able to observe that each slap left the imprint of a blackfish's fluke. Vera wrapped her arm around mine and said close to my ear, "There be whales here." "Beached whales," I said. "The ghosts of beached whales. Struggling to swim forward, but they're held in place. Why? Why would they be held in place? They're spirits. Guilt, I fear. The intense guilt hovering around this place has pierced holes between their realm and our physical one. It's acting like a net. Come, dear, we must discover what haunts this man." Vera had to pull me away from the vision of the flukes, away from the revelation that whales survive death. She dragged me back to where the two men had taken refuge from the haunted cottage. The phantoms struggling to swim through this structure continued their clamoring. A loud crash of glass caught our attention, and the moonlight revealed that a side window had shattered outward. "There's no time to waste. You must tell me what wrongs you've committed in the past, Mr. Lord," Vera entreated the captain. "In your nightmare you spoke of not having another junior. Did you disavow a son or do something worse to him?" The lopsided captain teetered and almost lost his balance, but Mr. Silva caught him. The old man swatted at the air, silently demanding to be allowed to stand on his own. Mr. Silva took a step back. The captain then steadied himself and turned toward Vera. It appeared to take him a moment to focus on her face.
"What do you accuse me of, fool woman? I've had no children. The Junior is a ship long gone. I served as second mate on her back in 57.
Did you commit some crime on board that ship? You must confess it, or the ghosts will continue their attack on your cottage."
The crime was committed against me. Mutiny it was. Murdered Captain Mellon and threatened to do the same to the first officer and myself. But the fiends reckoned they needed us to navigate them to Cape Howe. Kept me in irons with my wounds festering. There's your crime, woman.
Mr. Silva stepped forward.
These mutineers, do you think they might be the ones ransacking the cottage? He was asking anyone able to answer. Vera began to pace. No, the ghosts aren't human. You were right, Scully, about the prints over there. They were made by beached whales. We just observed a manifestation of them. The cottage happens to be in their way. They're struggling to get through it. Mr. Silva slowly faced the spot where he had discovered the prints. His jaw hung open a moment. He then dashed to that place where we witnessed the blurs of flukes. Meanwhile, Captain Lord sidled toward Vera and glared closely into her eyes.
Lunacy, woman,
he spit at her.
Ghosts of whales. A whale is a soulless beast. These ghosts are the conniving crew members I made examples of. No, madam, I made certain there'd be no mutiny aboard any ship I captained. At the earliest signs, I let the men know how I dealt with disobedience.
A piercing, agonized squeal sounded from within the cottage. I remembered the ceiling beam that was giving way to the poundings, and I pictured it twisting in two. The walls were now beginning to rock erratically. Tell me how you made examples of those crew members, Vera demanded. You say those men are ghosts? The ghosts you want driven back into the sea? What did you... She was unable to utter the words. I stepped forward. Captain Lord, did you throw those men overboard? Men who showed any sign of disobedience? Was that your way to prevent mutiny?
And not be accused by women,
the captain shrieked.
It's those men who have come back. It's them, I tell you. I had doubts I'd done right by 'em, but this proves they were wicked. Wicked and now cursed to roam the earth. And now they've found me to destroy what little I have. I'll not abide such insolence. Not from them, and certainly not from the likes of women.
At this, the captain shoved Vera out of his way. As if frozen in my own nightmare, I watched my dear friend hit the ground. Not until I saw her begin to roll and push herself upright did I regain cognizance to assist her. Scully, stop him! Vera shouted. She pointed toward the cottage door, struggling to keep her arm poised. We must bring him to justice! Captain Lord had managed to stagger back inside the cottage. Mr. Silva, clearly overwhelmed by all he was seeing, came running to us. He knelt down beside Vera, putting his arm around her waist to lift her. Don't bother with me, she moaned. That wretched sea captain confessed to tossing men overboard to prevent mutiny. There needs to be an inquest, a trial to see if his actions are defensible. There might not be time, I said, staring at the cottage. My meaning became clear when another shrill squeal pierced the air, a portent of what was about to happen. A major section of the roof collapsed with a thunderous crash and a whirlwind of debris. Shielding his eyes, Mr. Silva charged into what remained of the cottage, despite protests from Vera and myself. I stooped down beside Vera, hiding my face against her neck. I could hear that the quakes and strikes continued, but gradually the clamor diminished. The ghosts of the whales, it seemed, were freeing themselves of the dimensional net and swimming forward. I pulled my head back. Does this mean is Captain Lord dead? Vera put her hand gently to my cheek. Mr. Silva emerged from the wreckage with the captain limp in his arms. Vera and I helped each other up and rushed over to examine the old man's condition. There were no signs of life. The captain did not appear to have been crushed, though, despite some streaks of blood on his face. Subsequent medical reports confirmed what we had suspected. Captain Henry Thorne Lord had expired from an overstrained heart. I submit that it was the long dark shadow of what he had done to those sailors that had taken a toll on his heart, Vera said. His past finally caught up with him, so to speak. Mr. Silva set a beer before her. After a wearisome day of official interrogation and ultimately official exoneration, we were hoping to regain our composure at Scully's bar before the regulars arrived. That is sensible, Vera, I said. However, I see the captain as a man driven to monstrous acts, a man ensuring he'd never again suffer as he had on the Junior.
His attempts to beautify his cottage, meager as they were, suggest a deeply buried decency. Why else would there have been any guilt? And what do you think, Scully? He stroked his dark beard.
I think what stopped the old skipper's heart was your idea that his ghosts were whales. He paused and then added, if whales they were.
Vera's eyebrows shot upward. Did you not see the flukes striking the ground? I know they lasted only an instant, but Lucille and I both saw them.
I didn't have the lantern, remember. I don't know what I saw. Something, I guess. I certainly can't explain the invisible assault on the cottage. A smirk peeked through his beard. Ghostly whales caught between dimensions. Now that's a remarkable notion.
Mr. Silva moved to the far end of the bar, where he picked up a towel and began to wipe the insides of a line of beer glasses. The fact that these glasses were not wet implied he needed a moment alone. I leaned toward Vera. He's grappling with an afterlife that's large enough to include angels and ghosts and whales. It takes a while to accustom oneself to such expansion. But what I still grapple with is why Captain Lord stirred such disdain in you. Yes, he reminded you of your grandfather. So let me rephrase the question. Why does your grandfather stir such disdain in you? Vera ran a finger around the rim of her glass. His transporting slaves, especially transporting them to the Deep South, isn't enough, she asked. I realize my grandfather was simply following one school of thought during the era in which he lived, but would you have me ignore the tenement owner who preys on struggling immigrants because others in our own era do the same? Journalists, I reminded myself, prefer to ask the questions. Nonetheless, I persevered. When Captain Lord spoke of not having another junior, you assumed he meant a son. There is a certain logic in that. Yet you also asked if he disavowed his son or did something worse. Why might that have come to your mind? Vera slid her beer forward a bit and gazed in its direction. I continued. I ask because if the captain reminded you of your grandfather, I mean to say, and I sincerely hope I'm not being too bold, but, well, just as our understanding of the afterlife has been expanded on this trip, I wonder if we might expand our friendship, too. If only a bit. Without turning to me, Vera stated, My grandfather never acknowledged his son. He acted as if my father had never been born at all. She reached for her glass, but then withdrew her hands and folded them on her lap. I took her nearest hand and held it a moment. Vera, I said gently, such neglect is atrocious, perhaps beyond forgiveness even. Why would a father, how could any parent ignore a child that way? Were you ever told a reason? Vera glanced at me. She pulled her hand back, but it was so that she could caress my cheek. She replied, Be it one's understanding of the afterlife or of friendship, it takes a while to accustom oneself to such expansion. Vera and I sat at the bar patiently. We waited until the musicians arrived. Once they were prepared to play, we asked to hear some melancholy airs, but suggested that any rousing sea shanties be postponed for another evening, to honor the passing of the captain. So we said. What do you think? Do whales have spirits? I know that there are an awful lot of people who without hesitation would say yes, absolutely, and I admire their conviction. I'm not so certain myself. I'm certainly not a disbeliever. I will not say that whales don't have ghosts, but I take kind of an agnostic stance. I simply don't know. One thing I have more conviction in is the fact that in 1857, there was a whaling ship from New England, but working off the coast of Australia. Its name was the Junior, its captain was Captain Mellon, and there was a mutiny. They murdered the captain. The second mate had the almost fictional name of Henry Thorne Lord. They put him in manacles. They kept him alive because they needed him to guide the ship. This is just one example of the actual history Behind the Hauntings in the Vera Van Slyke Ghostly Mysteries. If you go to brownbonesbooks.com, you'll notice that each book in the series has its own page. On each page, there is a section called The History Behind the Haunting, where you can find links to actual documents that verify that some of the history in these stories is absolutely true. Now, it's called The History Behind the Hauntings on the page for Help for the Haunted, which is where this story comes from, because there are 13 investigations in that book. It's what's called a composite novel. Each chapter is its own little story. But I hope that people read them in order, because I introduce things in some of the early stories that come back in the later stories and are further developed. For instance, if you're curious about that family secret that Vera doesn't want to share, you'll find out more about that in that book, and you'll especially find out about it in the third book in the series, The Hound of the Seven Mounds. Once again, it's brownbonesbooks.com. Find out the actual history behind many of these ghost stories, and then maybe ask yourself, how real are these ghost stories? I'm Tim Prossel, ever the agnostic. Thank you very much for listening.